Hello and welcome to the LoveReading LitFest with me, Liz Robinson. And today I'm going to be talking to the current chair of the Crime Writers Association, and that's Maxim Jakubowski. And we're going to be chatting about this year's shortlist for the prestigious Crime Writers Association Dagger Awards. Welcome, Maxim.
Thanks for having me.
Maxim, before we actually go into talking about the awards, can you just tell me about the Crime Writers Association and when it started and why it is in being?
Well, basically, the Crime Writers Association began exactly 70 years ago in 1953. So coincidentally, we're also celebrating our Jubilee in that respect. Basically, at the time, there weren't all the literary festivals you have these days, so writers were in even more isolation than they were today. And what happened is that one of the most prolific crime writers, if not the most prolific writer in the history of writing, a gentleman called John Creasy, who was a British writer, who managed to write nearly 600 books during his life, managed to find a few minutes in his day to think about maybe it would be nice to talk to other writers, and in his case, particularly crime writers. So he sent a note out to a dozen or so other crime writers he knew about or had either met or knew how to contact, saying, wouldn't it be nice to get together just to have a chat? To have basically some social interaction. We all do the same thing. And he said, I booked a room at my club, which was the Reform Club in Piccadilly, which sounds almost like a Jules Verne around the world in 80 days beginning, and said, let me know if you can come, and because if you don't come, I don't want to order too many biscuits. And most of the, I think he invited a dozen people and 10 managed to come, and they decided on the spot, let's create an association that represents crime writers to promote the genre and basically to enjoy something of a social life. And the CWA, therefore, was created in 1953 and is now 70 years old and now has well over 1,000 members.
And is it just for British writers?
No, it's open to all writers. Naturally, the majority of members are British, but we do also have overseas members. We have associate members now, publishers, literary agents, reviewers can also join as associate members. And as of 2 years ago, and it's one of the things that I'm most happy about during my own incumbency of the CWA Chair, we now, after much opposition for many years, do now accept self-published authors. For many years, the association was pretty, should we say, old-fashioned, but then you must remember that it wasn't in the early years where people like Agatha Christie, Julian Simmons, almost anybody who was anybody in British crime writing was a member at some stage, although some did resign over the years over matters of pride or precedence or for absolutely silly reasons, as all writers do. And basically, now we have self-published authors. They have to show that they're reasonably professional. Not just anybody can join. We've got a sort of point system whereby we don't judge the quality. That's not our job to judge the quality of the book, but basically the presentation, the editing, etc. And the self-published authors have been members of the CWA now for 18 months, and it's still we're still joining in a steady fashion.
That's really good to hear, because self-publishing is kind of in the news at the moment, isn't it? As it were, with the self-publishing versus the traditional side of the publishing. So it's lovely that to hear that they're actually part of the CWA now.
Well, basically, the world of writing and publishing has changed enormously in the last 10 to 15 years. And one of the reasons I agreed to initially join, I was a member of CWA since the mid-1980s, but I agreed to join the board about 10 years ago and eventually was coerced, not physically, I dare say, to become chairman. Was because my own background is not just in writing. I've also worked as a publisher for many years, ran companies. So I think my colleagues wanted a more professional management approach to steadying and growing the CWA. And for me, falling into step with all the latest developments in publishing was one of those priorities.
Yeah, that's fabulous to hear. So let's talk about the actual awards now. When did they start at the same time, or when did they come in, and how have they changed over the years?
Basically, the Daggers, well, Daggers between inverted commas, began two years later. The then members thought it would be nice to commemorate some of the best books of the year, or actually the best book. There was only one Dagger. In fact, it was called the Cross Dagger initially. And it was, I think, in 1955, and it was done in conjunction with a Daily Telegraph and a well-known champagne company who offered, I think, 12 big bottles of champagne to the winner. And the first winner was no other than Winston Graham, the author of Poldark, who, of course, now his crime books are slightly forgotten, but he did write quite a few crime books, including Marnie, which was filmed by Alfred Hitchcock. But it was for another book that he got the first Cross Dagger. And then 2 years later, the sponsorship of the Daily Telegraph and the Champagne company fell to the side, even though Peter O'Donnell, the author of Modesty Blaise, who won it in the second year for a short story, complained for years on end that he only received one bottle rather than the 12 bottles of champagne which the publishers advertised. But then the CWA basically organised the Daggers themselves, and we've now been running it for 70 years. It's very simple. We've added some categories over the years, and we'll go through the categories when we talk about this year's shortlists. But the whole idea, and you've been a judge in two categories over the last decade, is that we have totally independent judges who have no contact whatsoever with board members of the CWA, although occasionally some board members are on an individual panel of judges. None of them do more than 3 years. In fact, some of them do less because of the sheer amount of books falling like undiffused bombs through their letterboxes. I mean,
I can agree with that one.
I understand from the chair of the Gold Dagger for the best novel of the year, but this year there are nearly 250 submissions, which of course are divided between the judges, but nonetheless, once they get to the long and short list, all the judges have to read them.
Yeah.
And so we now have 11 Daggers. We added, the last one we added was 4 years ago, where we decided to add a Crime Publisher of the Year award in recognition of the fact that publishers are sometimes useful. And basically, we try and update it on a regular basis. Sometimes judges move between categories. And I must say, and I'm totally prejudiced, of course, that when you look at the last 67, 68 years of a Dagger, and you look at past winners, I think virtually no crime writer of repute is missing from that role of honour. I mean, everybody's been on there. And so we have a pretty good track record. We haven't missed out. And I say that because, in fact, just a few weeks ago, our sister organisation in America, our equivalent in America, Mystery Writers of America, give out the Edgars named after Edgar Allan Poe. And I was doing an exercise a few weeks ago, and 2/3 of the winners of the last 30 years have just been totally forgotten.
Oh.
And, which I queried with some friends who are members of MWA, as I am, but I'm not involved, obviously, in the judging, being an overseas member of MWA. And they have a fairly similar system to what we have. So I'm just puzzled that some of the major writers of our time have never won an Edgar, unless it's been an honorary one at the end of their career when people have realised, oh, John Grisham has never had it, or
that's fascinating. Do you think then that there are some people who've won who should have actually been more widely recognised?
You mean in America?
Yeah.
Oh, in America, absolutely. A lot of major writers have missed out totally.
Yeah.
I'm fairly proud that the Daggers, in fact, I can't think of anybody. And actually, another thing I think the CWA should be very proud of is, and it is taken seriously by the publishing world, is that it has not only launched the careers of many writers, but in some cases helped. It's no secret, and I have it from Ian himself. Ian Rankin had written, I think, 8 or 9 books, which had had good reviews and sold in mediocre quantities. And one of his books, I can't remember if it was number 6 or 7 in the Inspector Rebus series, Black and Blue, had just been published and wasn't really doing that well commercially. And the publisher said, we're not renewing your contract. Then the book was longlisted, shortlisted, and actually won the Gold Dagger that particular year. And as a result, the publisher said, oh, well, we'll spend a bit of money now promoting it on the basis it's got a Gold Dagger. And that's where Ian Rankin's career actually began, even though, as I said, he was an overnight success after 12, 15 years of writing. And Ian has been quite open publicly that he owes it to the Daggers. And well, I said at the time he wasn't that well known, so we don't necessarily give the award to well-known people, but the majority of those who've won the award have gone on to have fairly glittering careers.
Yeah, it's wonderful. So before we actually talk about the shortlist that has been announced, this year you've been chairing the judging panel of the Crime Fiction in Translation, which I've been involved in as well. What is it that excites you most about this particular category?
Well, it's, I said, the latest Dagger to be created was the Publisher of the Year Dagger. The Crime Fiction in Translation Dagger was created, I think, about 15 or 18 years ago, purely because there are more and more translations, and also because there was a bit of controversy when actually a book in translation won the Gold Dagger. It was a book by Henning Mankell, one of these first published in England, which was great. But then, of course, a lot of people within and outside the association say, well, what's the point of a Daggers if you're giving it to a foreign writer? And there was quite a bit of controversy, and eventually the decision was taken quite correctly to give the a Dagger to the best book in translation. And yet again, something which I'm particularly happy about, or it has nothing to do with me whatsoever, publishers are now translating more and more books, not just in crime. I mean, I was brought up overseas. My first language was French, because even though my mother was British and my father Polish, we spoke English at home. And my first book was actually written in France, in French, because obviously it was my first language. And so I've always been very open to foreign culture, and there is as much great crime writing in other languages as there is in British. So that was the rationale behind the creation of the Crime Fiction in Translation Dagger.
Excellent. So we have now had the shortlist announced for the Daggers, and there is a fabulous mix of books. So I'd like to hand over to you to talk about your thoughts as to this year's picks. So if you'd like to go ahead, Maxim.
Well, obviously there are 11 categories. I won't go into all the categories, and you'll have to apologise for the fact I'm looking away from the camera occasionally because I have a list on another laptop next to me here, which is obviously the doors are sealed, the windows are obscured because as we record this, these haven't been announced quite yet. So it's the world's largest secret. Anyway, one of the categories I'm particularly pleased with is the short story Dagger. As is well known, I myself edit quite a lot of anthologies, and for I think on 6 occasions over the last 20, 25 years, the best short story of the year has gone to a story which I published. So I'm very excited by the fact that this year, even though my own favorite anthology of the year, a book called Black as the Night, which I thought, totally prejudiced again, was wonderful. In America, one of the stories was shortlisted for the Edgar Award for Best Short Story, and 3 other short stories were all selected for Best of the Year volumes, and not just in the crime world. In the UK, our judges ignored it totally. However, I did another book this year called The Perfect Crime, of stories from all over the world, and 4 stories made it onto the long list, and 2 have now made it onto the short list. Sadly, John Grisham, Who Needs the Money, had a story on the long list, but didn't survive all the way to the short list. So I have a short list here, and let me see. Short stories, here we are. They're all actually British writers. No, one American writer who appeared in the Marple collection of stories about Miss Marple by other writers. There's a story by the American writer Lee Bardugo. And there are some familiar names there. Abhi Mukherjee, who seldom writes short stories, and Vasim and I, who edited the book in which it appears, The Perfect Crime, really had to, it was like going to the dentist. We really had to pull that story out of him, and it's on the short list. There's also a story by C.J. Tudor, and the other one, which actually I haven't read because I wasn't a judge in the category. There is a story by Victoria and Delilah Dowd. Victoria Dowd, obviously, is a very popular British cosy author. And this was a story she wrote in lockdown with her 16-year-old daughter when they're sitting at home with nothing to do. And it's now made it onto the shortlist. So that's the short story Dagger. I'll move on to the crime fiction in translation Dagger, which obviously you were very involved in. And the shortlist basically ends up with uncharacteristically not one Scandinavian book this year, which is fairly unusual. And for many years, it wasn't the Dagger in translation, it was the Scandinavian Dagger, so to speak. So on the shortlist this year, we have 3 novels by 3 French authors, 1 Chinese, and 1 Spanish. And there's some great books there. You have the very popular French writer Michel Bussy, who obviously is a huge bestseller in France. You got a slightly lesser known, but she's one of the big upcoming talents, a book by Joanna Gustafsson, who sounds obviously very Swedish, but actually she cheated. She thought people would buy more of her books if she married a Swede. So now she has 5 books and 3 children as a result. Also, there is a book by a Chinese author. If I'm not mistaken, it's the first time a Chinese crime novel has ever been shortlisted for Dagger, a book called Bad Kids by Ziyi Chen. And another book, obviously, of great interest, a book called Even in the Darkest Night by the Spanish writer Javier Cercas, who is one of the most notable Spanish writers of his generation, and who decided to write a crime book. It's a very literary book, but also more excitingly, not only the fact that it's been shortlisted, but it's the beginning of a trilogy. And I was told actually by the publisher that the volume 2 will be arriving in my postbox either today or Tuesday. So I will find out what happens after the first volume. Then we have the historical Dagger, which also has a whole variety of settings and times. We have books by Leonora Natras, Blue Water, Sarah Smith, Harini Rajendra, the Bangalore Detective Club, British writer Anna Mazzola, who actually is one of the few authors who appears on 2 shortlists this year with the same book. She appears on the historical for her wonderful novel, The Clockwork Girl, which has also been shortlisted for the Gold. And also, and their first appearance on shortlists, British authors, D.B. Bishop and J.B. Myler for respectively The Darkest Sin and The Homes. And then we have the John Creasy dagger. Of course, John Creasy was there at the beginning and of the CWA, so it was only right and fair that one of the daggers is named after him. And coincidentally, we also have a new sponsor for that particular dagger, and the John Creasy New Blood dagger for Best First Novel is now sponsored by ILP, International Literary Properties, who look after the estate of John Creasy. So the circle is closing. Obviously, none of the names are very well known because these are all first novels, but I'll mention the names, and I'm sure that if shall I say, historians of the future look at all these strange conversations on the internet, lingering on the internet in 20 years, they'll say, oh God, those authors all became big. So I'll mention in alphabetical order Amanda Cassidy, Joey Hartstone, Jack Lutz, two Australian authors, Hayley Scrivener and Emma Stiles, and Patricia Wolfe, who I think might actually be Australian too. So I know that 3 of the books are actually set in Australia, and one of them is set in a sort of dystopian London. That's London in Black by Jack Lutz. So it's a fairly exciting list. And then on to the second of the most prestigious daggers, which is a steel dagger, which is for the best thriller of the year and has for many years been sponsored by the Ian Fleming estate. And here we have some very familiar names. We have a certain Robert Galbraith for the last book in the Joe Rowling series, The Ink Black Heart. And I pity all the judges who had to probably read and reread a book which is over 1,000 pages several times, but it's made it to the shortlist, which shows that she is still incredibly popular. And Mike M.W. Craven has a book on the list, which is The Botanist. And of course, Mike last year won the Gold Dagger for his previous book in that series. So he's certainly popular with judges, albeit in 2 different categories. So there are no judges in common. And of course, the Canadian author Linwood Barclay has also made the shortlist with Take Your Breath Away. And then 2 big debut authors who ironically don't appear on the Creasy. The British-based American author Ava Glass for Alias Emma, and the screenwriter John Brownlow for 17. And the final book in the series is the Edinburgh crime novel. It's a long-standing series, but an excellent one, and I think the first time it's been recognised, May God Forgive by Alan Parks. And on, obviously, to... Hold on. Oh, I thought I'd arrange for some trumpets to sound in the background, but my tech is inadequate. The Gold Dagger. Well, the Gold Dagger obviously had a great long list, although I personally thought, oh, there are 2 books there that I expected who weren't there, but it just shows that you just never know. And nonetheless, the judges have got some wonderful titles there. And I'll just mention them in alphabetical title. George Dawes Green, The Kingdoms of the Savannah, which is a wonderful sort of American Southern noir by an author who only writes a book every 7 or 8 years. You might remember his first book, The Caveman's Apprentice, many years ago. And this, I think, is only his 4th or 5th novel. And it's an interesting book because, in fact, the British publisher almost published it confidentially last year. It's coming out in paperback, I think, just to coincide with these announcements. But it initially came out and wasn't distributed into bookshops. It was only distributed on export, so that the British publisher had copies to compete in the export markets with the American edition. But it virtually never made it. It was available online, but was never sold into bookshops. So it's wonderful that the judges have recognized it. The next one is by an author who actually won the historical dagger, and of course is my co-editor on The Perfect Crime, and subject obviously to our AGM will become the next chair of the CWA, Maxim Khan, with the latest book in his Bombay series, The Lost Man of Bombay. There's a first novel by Simon Mason, who appears to be the writer who's taken over the mantle of Oxford Killings from the venerable killing arm of Colin Dexter with A Killing in November. And as I mentioned earlier, Anna Mazzola with The Clockwork Girl. The Irish writer William Ryan, who's been around for some time, but also hasn't been recognised by many awards, with The Winter Guest. And finally, a book by a small independent press, which is a gangster tale, but obviously a very literary one and beautifully written, set in Newcastle by, he was an author I'd never heard of, called Simon van der Velde, for a book called The Silent Brother. So a mixture of well-known names, of veterans who are finally coming to the front of the stage, and of total newcomers also. And of course, the one, obviously, which is no secret, every year, the Diamond Dagger, which is the dagger for life achievement, and that's voted for by the members and the board of CWA, will be given to Walter Mosley, who's coming over to the UK for the occasion. And it's one I'm personally incredibly pleased, because obviously Walter is not just an incredible writer, still very much underrated in the UK, whereas in America, I think he's won every award, even well outside crime, for his non-fiction. And Walter is happens to be an old friend of mine, although my vote was just one of many. And we have a long story going back. And so far, we had a book published on the same day with the same publisher 35 years ago. Walter's was Devil in a Blue Dress, the first in his Easy Wall-In series, and mine was an anthology called London Noir, both published by Serpent's Tail. And over the years, obviously, I've been meeting Walter when he's over in the UK. We have a meal when I've been in New York. And by total coincidence, on 2 occasions in the last 15 years or so, we've both happened to be in American airports on the same concourse, but in different waiting groups. Walter waiting to go to one place, me waiting to go another, and this has happened twice. And the other major coincidence is my wife and I were on holiday in Marina del Rey in California one year, and we were sitting at breakfast in our hotel, and I picked up the local newspaper, and I saw, Walter Mosley is signing at the Book Passage in a small Californian town, which was 10 miles away. We had a hard car, so I thought, we'll give Walter a surprise. And we drove to the signing and surprised Walter by being there. And after the signing, we all went out to have dinner together. And Walter's mum, who lived in a retirement home at the time in California, was there also signing. So Walter's mum came, and it was a wonderful dinner, as is no secret. Obviously, Walter is not only obviously a black crime writer and one of the few, unfortunately, although there are now more and more, but also because his mother is white, but is also Jewish. Walter is black and Jewish. And it was a wonderful dinner because his mum was your typical Jewish mother. And it was all the time, oh, isn't he wonderful? My son, the black Jewish crime writer. So I'm very pleased that Walter will be getting the Diamond Dagger, where I said every major name in the history of crime has been given it, and it was certainly time for him to move up to that level.
That's fabulous. When will the winners actually be announced, Maxim?
They will be announced at the annual gala. So I know some members of the board say, "Oh, gala, no, that's too fancy." Anyway, the annual awards dinner, which is held at the Leonardo Hotel in the City in London on the 6th of July. And obviously, most of it will be streamed live on YouTube. And so on that evening, people will find out who are the winners. I know, but...
You know, but your lips are sealed.
Okay.
Fabulous. And thank you, Maxim. Thank you so much for joining us and for talking about the shortlisted books for the Crime Writers Association Dagger Awards. I actually could talk to you forever because you are fascinating and I love listening to your stories, but we're going to have to wrap it up now. So thank you, Maxim. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Liz, and love reading. Bye-bye.